The year is 1502, and a cold, soaking fog coils around the stones of Ludlow Castle, clinging to the windows like a whisper of something watching, waiting, hovering just beyond the veil. Inside, on a damp feather mattress, the Prince of Wales burns with fever, his skin clammy and his breath shallow. A boy of 15 locked in battle with an invisible enemy that had already taken countless lives before him. At his side, Catherine of Aragon, 16, shivering, defiant, and royal to the bone, prays without pause, her whispered Spanish litanies weaving through the night air like spells meant to anchor him to the realm of the living. He is not just any boy, and she is not just any bride. He is Arthur, heir to a fragile dynasty, held together by battlefield blood and royal marriages. The first stone laid in what his father hopes will become a new Camelot. She is the daughter of the two most powerful monarchs in Christendom. The bride who has traveled across Europe to bind England to Spain in steel, silk, and bloodline. In our world, that fever wins. The boy dies. Catherine survives, hollowed by grief but still young, still valuable, and still royal enough to be handed like a coin from one Tudor son to another. The king we know, Henry VIII, a boy of 10 when his brother died, was never meant for the crown. He was being groomed for the church, for quiet power, for theology and Latin, but fate, brutal and precise, changed course on the 2nd of April that year. And with one death, it reordered an entire continent. From that death came a whirlwind, 6 wives, 2 beheaded queens, the ripping of England from the Catholic Church, the rise and fall of Anne Boleyn, the brief rule of a sickly boy king, the blood-soaked reign of Mary I, and finally, the golden, glimmering mask of Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the Protestant champion, the mother of empire and myth. But not this time. This time, the fever breaks. This time, Arthur lives. At first, there is only stunned relief. The kingdom breathes again. The Spanish alliance holds. Queen Elizabeth of York collapses into tears of joy. King Henry VII, ever the calculating spider, weaving his web of survival, thanks God with a rare, whispered sincerity, for his dynasty, for his plan, for his prophecy embodied in flesh has survived. Catherine remains by Arthur's side, not as a widow to be reassigned, but as a wife, bound by shared trauma, their bond now forged in the hottest fire of fear. And far away in London, a 10-year-old boy named Henry returns to his Latin books, his theology lectures, and the quiet, unspectacular future the world had originally written for him. And from that single survival, the wheel turns again, but in a direction no one ever expected. As Arthur grows, so does his legend. Unlike his father, a man hard-edged by war and suspicion, Arthur becomes a king in waiting, shaped by books, diplomacy, and almost dying. When he ascends the throne at 22, he does so not as a brash teenager, but as a prepared monarch with a son already born, named Henry after his grandfather. With Catherine at his side and a second child on the way, there is no vacuum, no scramble for power, no Wolsey rising from the dust, no Cromwell with legal knives, no Thomas, more caught between faith and fate, just stability, just the long, calm breathing of a kingdom that does not know chaos is even an option. But the younger brother, the younger brother is still there. Henry, Duke of York, charming and athletic, brilliant and headstrong, does not vanish into shadows. He charges into the church like a knight charges into battle, rising swiftly through the ranks, propelled by blood and brilliance. By 30, he is Cardinal Henry, Archbishop of York, a warrior priest with fire in his sermons and steel in his hands. He does not envy the crown, but he does not forget it either. He remains loyal, dangerous, magnetic, the ghost of a king that never was. Meanwhile, King Arthur rules not with swords and spectacles, but with treaties, trade routes, and scholars. His court is not the theater of golden tents and feasts, but a quiet storm of intellect and diplomacy, filled with Renaissance thinkers from Italy and Flanders. Lit by candlelight, colored with illuminated manuscripts, echoing with madrigals rather than cannon fire, England becomes a beacon, not of military might, but of quiet strength and cultural flowering. It is rich. It is Catholic. It is content. Then, from across the sea, the fire starts again. In the year 1517, Martin Luther nails his fury to a church door in Wittenberg, and Europe catches flame. In our world, Henry VIII's vanity and desperation ignited England's own religious revolution. His desire for a male heir ripping the church apart. But here, Arthur has sons. Arthur has Catherine. Arthur has no reason to break with Rome. He has, instead, every reason to remain loyal to it, and so England does not fracture. It purifies. With Catherine beside him and Cardinal Henry as his inquisitor-in-chief, Arthur cracks down on the Protestant contagion with terrifying efficiency. Heretics burn. Pamphlets are seized. The first sparks of English reform are smothered beneath velvet robes and steel gauntlets. There are no monasteries dissolved. No land grabs by hungry gentry. No sudden surge of wealth into the crown. The abbeys remain intact, glowing beacons of medieval faith and tradition. Power stays feudal. The future stays on pause, and with every quiet year, history closes its alternate doors. There is no Anne Boleyn summoned from the sidelines, no Elizabeth born of scandal and fire, no Armada, no Drake, no Shakespeare writing for a country forged by isolation and defiance, no pilgrims fleeing to a new world. The English identity we know, Protestant, naval, imperial, bold, is never formed. The Americas wait, but perhaps never call England's name. The world Arthur built is gentle, ordered, pious, and unshaken. And yet, somewhere in that silent palace, beneath the candles and Latin hymns, there is the softest echo of the world we lost, or perhaps the world that lost us, because in this new world, a boy lived, and in doing so, he erased everything we would someday become. In the spring of the year 1505, the bells of Westminster rang not for war, nor mourning, nor the execution of a queen, but for something far older and far rarer hope fulfilled. The queen had given birth, not a stillborn disappointment, not a princess to be shuffled aside, not a ghost of potential, but a son, living and loud, with lungs full of life and fingers curling around the air like he already owned it. His name would be Henry, not after the younger brother now robed in scarlet and gold as the Cardinal Archbishop of York, but after the king who had built this careful tower of survival brick by bloodied brick, Henry VII, the architect of dynasty, the man who had once clutched a crown on a battlefield and prayed it would not slip from his fingers. This child, This new Henry, born not from fear or urgency, but from love and deliberate preparation, was a child of marble halls and steady hearts. King Arthur, now 21, and already beloved for the calm intelligence he brought to statecraft, stood at the Queen's bedside, not as a stranger fumbling to secure his line, but as a man who had waited patiently for this moment. He had survived the grave by inches 3 years earlier. And now he felt as he took the swaddled boy in his arms that something far greater than survival had taken root within him. He was not simply the son of a usurper trying to buy legitimacy with Spanish gold and royal brides. He was the beginning of a new age, an English monarch with Roman blood, Iberian flame, and the self-control to resist both sword and seduction. Catherine, too, was no longer the foreign princess navigating a new tongue and a suspicious court. She had become an English queen and full fluent in the customs, revered for her dignity, and adored by a people who saw in her not only the alliance with Spain but the grace of a woman who had stood beside their king through sickness and silence. There was no annulment. There was no broken bedchamber testimony. There were no whispers about consummation, no papal dispensations, no theological loopholes stretched to breaking. Theirs was a marriage forged in the simple to radical truth that it had survived. And because it had survived, the kingdom changed. Over the next several years, England did not explode outward in ambition, but deepened inward in confidence. The young King Arthur spent more time among books than banners, more time with ambassadors than admirals. He restructured the royal council, not through fear and spectacle, but through careful elevation of scholars and merchants, men who had earned their voices not through bloodline but through reason. Catherine hosted salons at court, in which conversation flowed in 5 languages and music from Italy interwove with debate about Erasmus and Aquinas. There were no heretics yet, not in their eyes, but there were stirrings, already, in the lowlands, in the forests of Saxony. New ideas slithered beneath cathedral stones. But Arthur was not blind. He watched. He did not lash out preemptively, as his brother might have done. He did not burn books or ban tongues. Instead, he prepared the ground-building universities, sending envoys to Rome, strengthening the ties with Spain and the Habsburg Empire, not through brash conquest but through god-parenthood, shared trade privileges, and patient diplomacy. His son, young Henry, was raised under both an English tutor and a Castilian scholar. He spoke Latin before he rode a horse. He kneeled in prayer before he ever practiced swordplay. He was not bred for chaos. He was being shaped to preserve peace. But peace has its price. As the kingdom grew richer, as wool exports surged and new roads knit the shires tighter together, there was a growing sense, muted but persistent, that something restless stirred beneath the surface. The old noble houses, still powerful from the Wars of the Roses, did not forget their lineage, and they began to chafe under the growing influence of merchants and scholars, brought to prominence by the king's favor. The gentry, in contrast, and found themselves without opportunity to rise. There was no sudden redistribution of monastery land. There were no fire sales of abbey estates. The church remained the greatest landlord in England, and its grip was unbroken. Power remained where it had always been above. Yet the people did not riot. They murmured. They waited. In the north, the great houses held feasts that quietly rivaled those of the crown. In London, whispers about Martin Luther reached Cambridge long before they were acknowledged by Parliament. But still, Arthur refused to react with fear. He believed in truth emerging through discourse, not in crushing dissent before it could form. And yet, in this patience lay his greatest blind spot. For across the channel, the flames of Reformation were no longer flickers. In the year 1517, Martin Luther shattered the stillness of Europe with his 95 Theses. And suddenly every pulpit from Paris to Prague trembled. Rome reeled. Germany splintered. The printing press became a weapon of war. And the soul of Europe was up for auction. England, though, held its line. It held its line because King Arthur had something his brother never would heirs. He did not need a divorce. He did not need to fight the Pope. He did not need to invent new theology to mask his personal desire. And so, when the pamphlets arrived, smuggled in barrels of French wine and sewn into the hems of student cloaks, they were met not with open arms but with quiet, methodical purge. The Archbishop of York, Henry, still fierce, still ablaze, with controlled rage, became the hammer of heresy. He ordered public debates and private interrogations. He read every line of Luther's challenges and wrote answers in red ink, not simply to refute, but to destroy. It was not fanaticism. It was doctrine with discipline. Catherine stood with her husband as a queen, should be heir, not as a pawn, but as a scholar in her own right. She and Arthur co-authored a treatise defending the 7 sacraments. When it was published in Latin, it bore not only Arthur's signature, but Catherine's too. The Pope sent a golden rose. The Catholic world breathed easier. England had not fallen. England had stood. And yet, something deeper had already shifted. For even as the king's policies remained measured, even as his court remained devout and noble, the outside world did not stand still. Scotland flirted with Lutheranism. France fractured. Spain fought to keep control of its empire and its Inquisition. And in the shadows of all this, a boy named Thomas More, once destined for obscurity, wrote a book about a place that did not exist. He called it Utopia. It was not just a dream. It was a warning. And so, as the young Prince Henry approached his 12th year, loved, learned, and surrounded by a court that prized reason over revolution, the stage was quietly set for something that no king, no queen, and no cardinal could ever fully control the turning of time. Because though King Arthur had lived, and though his marriage had held, and though his heir was strong, the world outside, England's green and gentle borders, had already begun to break apart. And the cracks would not ask permission before they reached his throne. He had been born in the shadow of a crown he was never meant to wear. A second son destined for the church, not because of calling or faith, but because his older brother had taken the throne before him. And there was nowhere else to place such fire. Henry, Duke of York no longer, had long since shed the silk of a young prince and pulled over himself the scarlet robes of a cardinal. A warrior dressed as a priest. A statesman cloaked in liturgy. A man whose sermons could still the hearts of thousands and whose riding boots were always dusted from the road. Not the cathedral floor. He had not risen quietly. He had not surrendered. He had become something England had never truly seen before. A man of blood and gospel, of crown and cross. Bound, not by jealousy of a throne he could not have, but by a relentless need to be something more than forgotten. And yet, in every hall where he walked, his brother's portrait still hung larger. King Arthur was serene, composed, a scholar turned sovereign, ruling with grace and distance, never raising his voice and rarely raising his hand. He had survived death, and that experience had marked him, not with rage, but with restraint. There were no wars declared in his name, no exiles from court for trivial slights. No wives disgraced and cast aside. The throne of Arthur was unshaken. The crown he wore fit him too well to provoke challengers. But Henry carried the weight of what could have been, and though he never said it, though he never wrote it, though he never once let it slip in speech or wine, England always knew that if Arthur had died in that castle, the kingdom would have become something else entirely, and that something might have burned brighter, or it might have burned to ash. But Henry had no sword. Instead, he wielded books. He wielded pulpits and papal bulls, drafted letters in 7 languages, and debated Luther's disciples before the ink of their rebellion had even dried. He was never king, but he was feared across Europe. The French king once called him the Red Wolf of England, not because he hunted, but because he circled and stared until weaker men broke into confession or silence. Rome adored him. Spain trusted him, and his brother Arthur loved him. In the quiet, private way that only siblings shaped by war and fever can love, without needing to explain, without needing to compete, without needing to win. It was this strange, unspoken harmony that kept England whole. Even as Germany tore itself into fragments and France trembled at the edge of rupture, the world was convulsing. But in England, 2 men stood at the helm, one with a crown and one with a crozier. One who ruled from the marble steps of Westminster, and one who thundered from cathedral pulpits as if he were drawing angels down by the sheer force of his certainty. And between them, there was peace. But peace is not the same as stillness. There were questions now, whispered from Cambridge halls to Yorkshire manors. Soft and daring. Why must the Bible remain in Latin? Why must the abbeys hold so much land? Why must the poor bow to the cross, but never be allowed to read the words upon it? These were not questions born of rebellion. They were born of hunger. And while King Arthur answered with reforms, small ones, measured ones, commissions of inquiry, modest loosening of trade restrictions, funding for grammar schools, Cardinal Henry answered with flame. It was he who ordered the first bonfires of contraband books in Oxford. He who traveled to Norwich to speak against the creeping rot of heresy himself. He who organized the Royal Inquisition not as a spectacle of torture, but as a clean, clerical machine that ensured each name on the list was there by evidence, by confession, or by fate. He did not burn out of hatred. He burned out of belief. But the people remembered the heat all the same, and so it was that by the year 1525, a strange rhythm had overtaken the country. The king ruled softly, slowly, a master of patience and preservation. The cardinal ruled sharply, swiftly, a surgeon cutting out anything that smelled of revolution. And the people, those who lived between the palace and the pulpit, began to live in a strange kind of double faith. They knelt before the Virgin Mary but whispered Erasmus at night. They prayed the rosary in public, but copied forbidden verses behind shutters. And in the darkness, beneath torchlight and beneath silence, something else began to grow. It was not a rebellion. It was not a war. It was a thought. And even Cardinal Henry, who had devoted his life to catching thoughts before they grew teeth, could not crush what he could not name. The sword he had never drawn still hung at his side, ceremonial, unused. The hilt worn from years of processions and sermons. He had never needed to fight his brother. He had never had to stand on a battlefield. He had never been forced to choose between blood and God. But somewhere, deep inside the man, who had once been a boy promised nothing but priesthood, there lingered the smallest ember of a question he could not ask. What would have happened if I had worn the crown? And it was that question, not the pamphlets, not the poets, not the restless nobles or the discontented students that would one day shape the kingdom more than any battle ever could. Because when fire comes from the outside, it is easy to see it, to name it, to contain it. But when it comes from within, from the minds of kings and the minds of brothers, it is silent and slow and impossible to stop once it begins to burn. It was in the coldest winter in living memory that the marriage was arranged. Not by flame, nor urgency, nor war, but by the slow, deliberate hand of statecraft, dressed in silk and sealed with wax. The year was 1530, and the snow had not stopped falling for 9 straight days. Ice clung to the branches of every tree in Kent, like the bones of long-dead queens, and the Thames froze solid enough that merchants walked across it with carts, their footsteps muffled by white silence, and the weight of decisions made far from their sight. In the warmth of Greenwich Palace, Queen Catherine sat beside the fire, her hair streaked with silver now, her hands thinner than they once were. But her eyes, the same eyes that had once locked with Arthur's across the candle-lit corridors of Ludlow Castle, still sharp, still unflinching. And beside her stood their daughter. She was 17, tall, poised, with the calm presence of someone raised to be watched. She was not called Elizabeth. There was no Anne Boleyn in this world to give her name to a future queen. She was named Maria, after Catherine's mother, Queen Isabella of Castile. And she carried in her voice the weight of both empires, Spain and England, folded into one. When she moved, the court fell silent. When she looked at you, you remembered your place. And yet, behind that quiet command was something else, a softness that came not from ambition, but from love. Because Maria had grown up in a household where love had not been a battlefield. Her parents had never fought publicly, never shamed each other before the court, and never made her choose a side. She had been raised in a palace where candles burned for study, not penance, where the shadows of queens fallen before her had never existed. Her mother had never been divorced. Her father had never chased ghosts. She was whole. And so, when the suitor arrived from Vienna, tall and thin and pale, with a Habsburg jaw and a letter from the emperor himself, there was no urgency in the air, only frost. His name was Maximilian, a cousin of sorts, twice removed, and bred for diplomacy, like a stallion is bred for strength. He smiled, little. He bowed low. He spoke Latin fluently, and Castilian, passably, and English, with a soft Austrian hush. He came not to woo, but to negotiate. And Maria, trained from childhood in the art of quiet listening, I knew within moments that this marriage was not for her heart. It was for something colder and older: continental alignment, royal bloodlines, the prevention of French encroachment, and the sealing of trade routes through the Netherlands. He was not cruel. He was not kind. He was simply necessary. The court murmured with approval. The king said little but nodded once when the proposal was formally made. The queen turned her face to the fire and did not speak for the rest of that evening. And the girl Maria smiled, because she had been trained to smile, and because tears had no place in a face that bore the eyes of her mother and the silence of her father. The date was set. The cathedral was chosen. The embroidery began, but the storm had already begun. It did not roar in with lightning or thunder. It crept like frost along the edges of letters. It hummed through the halls of Cambridge and Oxford, in whispered German and forbidden Dutch. It traveled in song, in margins of books, in the hesitations of young priests. The Reformation, though held at bay by Cardinal Henry's fierce hand and the king's unshakable loyalty to Rome, had begun to find its way, In through the smallest cracks, a mistranslated gospel read aloud in a Norfolk barn. A child caught reciting verses not approved by Canterbury. A printer in Bristol whose presses ran through the night with words that glowed with the light of rebellion. It was not war. Not yet. But it was rising. And then came the snow. On the morning the marriage procession was to ride from Whitehall to St. Paul's for the public betrothal blessing. The skies opened with such ferocity that even the guards hesitated. Snow, thick as wool and silent as sin, blanketed every road. Horses stumbled. Torches sputtered. The carriage meant to carry Maria veered off the road and struck a stone hidden beneath the drifts, breaking a wheel and throwing the chamberlain into the ditch with a groan and a crack of bone. They waited 3 hours in a nearby manor house. Maria did not complain. Maximilian said nothing at all. When they finally arrived at the cathedral, the bells had frozen, and the choir sang to an empty nave. It was taken as a bad omen. The superstitious whispered it openly. Cardinals crossed themselves more fervently. And Catherine, who had lived through the darkest winters of Spain and England, both stared out at the snow and saw not weather, but warning. She took her daughter's hand that night and told her, in Spanish so soft, it melted against the tapestries, that love is not always born of silk and treaties, and that sometimes storms do not break when they pass, but when they settle inside you. Maria did not cry, but something inside her, some warmth that had once glowed so gently, began to dim. The wedding did not fail. It was not called off, but it became something else, less a celebration, more a transaction wrapped in velvet. Maximilian returned to Vienna to prepare for her arrival. Maria remained behind, her trunks packed, her Spanish retinue summoned, her farewell audiences scheduled. The people cheered, as they were told to. The bards composed verses. The tapestries were altered to bear a new crest. But beneath it all, beneath the gold thread and gilded psalters and public prayers, the storm thickened, because outside London, in corners not yet touched by the king's moderation nor the cardinal's scrutiny, new voices had begun to sing. They sang of scripture in English. They sang of a church not ruled by Rome. They sang of a God who did not need a pope to speak. And though the snows would melt, and spring would come, and Maria would sail for Vienna, with her eyes open and her heart closed, the storm would not vanish. It would simply change shape, and the world that Arthur and Catherine had fought to preserve whole, holy, harmonious, was beginning to slip from their grasp like snow off a bare branch, beautiful and cold, and impossible to hold forever. There are women in history whose names are written in ink, whose lives are carved into stone, whose portraits hang in galleries, and whose legacies glow like stained glass in royal chapels. And then, there are the others, the ones whose faces look too much like power, whose presence echoed too close to a throne, and who, in time, were quietly erased. This is the story of one such woman, a cousin of the Queen, a shadow of a daughter, and the bride at a wedding that was never meant to be remembered. Her name was Eleanor. She had been born in the year 1510, in a manor house near Peterborough, to a minor branch of the Tudor bloodline, so distant that no one thought to fear it, at least not at first. Her mother had once been a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine in her early years, and her father, a knight with enough breeding to matter, but not enough to threaten, had raised her with books and music and the quiet expectation that she would marry well and live unseen. But Eleanor, as it happened, was not built to be unseen. She had her cousin Maria's eyes, the same deep-set gaze inherited from the Castilian line, and the same high cheekbones that reminded courtiers of Queen Catherine in her youth. She walked like a princess, even though no crown would ever grace her head. And when she entered a room, people turned not because they were summoned, but because they were startled. There is a difference between beauty and presence, and Eleanor had the latter in unsettling abundance. She was sent to court at 15, as many girls of her standing were, to serve in Maria's household before her departure to Vienna. But where most girls faded behind tapestries and whispered duties, Eleanor lingered like perfume in the hallways, noticed by everyone and understood by no one. It was not long before poems began to appear beneath bedsheets and on the backs of songbooks, anonymous verses about a girl with storm-gray eyes and the smile of a queen who had never sinned. The king ignored it. The cardinal frowned. And Queen Catherine, who noticed everything, watched silently from the gallery above. It was a courtier who first brought the rumor to light that Eleanor had been seen walking the cloisters with a foreign diplomat's younger brother, a man with no land but plenty of charm, a man whose boots were always muddy, but whose hands were always clean. His name was Thomas d'Aubigny, half French, half English, and wholly uninterested in war or diplomacy. He played the lute badly, but made her laugh. He spoke her name like a secret, and sometime in the summer of 1528, beneath the arches of a ruined priory during a festival, he asked her to marry him, and she said yes. They told no one. There was no license, no dowry, no blessing, just a ring made of woven grass, a whispered vow in a dialect neither of them understood fully, and the rush of reckless joy that comes when two people believe, wrongly, that love is stronger than order. For a time, they lived like ghosts among the corridors, brushing fingers in the shadows, passing folded notes in prayer books, building a life that could never breathe in daylight. But secrets, like roots, grow. It was Maria who discovered them not by accident, but by instinct. She had returned to England for a brief season of mourning after the death of Maximilian's brother. And upon seeing Eleanor again, something flickered. It was not jealousy. It was recognition. The way the court looked at Eleanor was how they had once looked at her. And the way Eleanor looked at Thomas, careless, fearless, was not how queens were taught to look at anyone. One quiet afternoon, in a walled garden, overrun with lavender, Maria sat beside her cousin and asked only one question. "Did you think no one would notice you were becoming me?" Eleanor did not answer. She didn't have to. The next morning, the order came. Eleanor was to leave court immediately. No explanation was offered. No accusation made. Her trunks were packed by others. Her dresses remained untouched in the wardrobe. Her letters were burned unread. Thomas vanished the same night, spirited away by men who did not wear uniforms, but who carried the authority of someone higher than the king. Some said he was given a ship. Others said he was buried in a wood near Dover. But no one ever saw him again. Eleanor was sent north, to a convent once patronized by Queen Elizabeth of York, nestled in the hills beyond Durham, where the wind howled so fiercely it drowned even memory. She was not imprisoned. She was not disgraced. She was simply removed. The court did not speak of her. Her name was struck from the household rolls. When servants asked where the Queen's cousin had gone, they were told she had married into obscurity, which, in a way, was true. But there were those who remembered. A court musician refused to play for months. A chambermaid was dismissed for weeping during Mass. And in the years that followed, whenever Queen Maria walked the palace alone, she would sometimes pause before the mirror in the long gallery and stare not at herself, but at the space beside her reflection, as though searching for someone who was no longer there. The wedding had been secret. The love had been forbidden. And the punishment had been merciful in its silence. But what the court never understood, what even Maria herself would only realize much later, was that Eleanor had not been exiled for falling in love. She had been exiled because she had reminded the world that queens are made by blood and law. But power answers to presence. And Eleanor, for a brief moment, had carried too much of both. There are places that breathe differently at night, stone halls that echo not just footsteps, but the memory of what was spoken when no one was listening. One such place was Ravensshade Castle, a grey-limbed fortress tucked between the moors and the sea, too distant from London to be watched carefully, but close enough to matter when silence was required. It had belonged to the crown for 3 generations, but had rarely been used for more than hunting or exile, and in the year 1531, it became home to a queen who no longer wore her crown in Vienna, but returned to England with a heart heavy as marble and a silence that no one dared to name. Queen Maria came back, not as a widow, her husband Maximilian still lived, but as a guest between courts. A figure without a title that meant anything anymore. The alliance had cooled. The letters came less often. Her chambers in the Viennese palace had been reassigned to a younger archduchess with brighter prospects and fewer opinions. And so, the princess who had once been England's living alliance returned to her father's land. Not defeated, but changed. She was no longer a daughter, no longer quite a queen, and perhaps, in her own mind, no longer even herself. And so, she was sent to Ravensshade, not as punishment, but as retreat. The castle was old. Its tapestries were worn. Its chapel smelled faintly of peat and dust. The gardens had not been trimmed in seasons, and vines curled around the arched stone windows, as if nature itself was trying to reclaim her. But Maria, once known for her posture, her stillness, her precise Spanish dignity, found something in the wildness that soothed her. She walked the gardens alone for hours, her gloves in her hands, her hair no longer bound in court braids, but left to fall as it pleased. She asked for no company. She answered no letters. And at night, she left candles burning in windows that faced the sea, as if waiting for a ship that had never been promised. No one dared question her. The household staff spoke in whispers. The steward wrote weekly reports to London but filled them with more weather than truth. And when Cardinal Henry visited that winter, dismounting with his usual red fury and pacing the drawing room like a wolf held too long on a leash, Maria received him in silence, said only what was necessary. And when he tried to speak of Vienna, of diplomacy, of a second marriage and duty, and the eyes of Europe, she turned her back to him and walked into the garden without a cloak. He never visited again. But the castle remembered, because it was in that year, during the summer, when the moors turned purple with heather and the air smelled faintly of salt and honey, that something shifted in the rhythm of Ravensshade. A visitor arrived unmarked, unheralded, unnamed. He came by horse, alone, cloaked in travel dust, and was brought through the servants' entrance without fanfare. No trumpets, no coat of arms, no announcement, just a man, tall and quiet, with a book in his hand and a scar across the bridge of his nose that looked older than most of the stonework in the chapel. He stayed 3 nights. No one knew where he slept. No one knew his name. The steward was told only that the queen required solitude and that the guest would leave before dawn on the 4th morning. And he did. But something in the castle changed after he went. Maria spoke more softly. laughed once while walking the lower garden path, and began to write again in her journals, pages filled not with policy or court gossip, but with sketches of stars and poetry in the margins of old Latin hymns. She sang to herself. Sometimes, and once, when a maid passed too close to the old rose corridor, she saw the queen standing barefoot on the stone floor, her hand pressed to the wall as though listening for something that could not be heard in daylight. She would not explain. When asked, gently, by the abbess who had come to offer prayers and advice, Maria only smiled and said, "Some days are not for remembering." But the windows of the West Tower glowed later than before. The roses were trimmed, and once, a letter was sent without seal or signature, carried by a boy who could not read and instructed to deliver it to no one but the man with the quiet eyes. No one knew what became of the letter. The boy never returned, and still, the castle waited. For years, Ravenshade remained her refuge. She received guests rarely, answered royal invitations with regret, and declined all proposals, regardless of how carefully they were wrapped in diplomacy. She painted now, though she showed her work to no one. And she walked, always the walking along the cliffs, through the gardens, down to the ruined chapel at the edge of the wood. When she passed, the servants stepped aside, not because they feared her, but because they sensed that something walked beside her memory. Perhaps, or sorrow, or simply the weight of knowing what it means to be born for history, and then asked to step out of it quietly. Years later, when news came of her father's death, King Arthur passing peacefully in his study with a prayer book in hand and a half-written letter on his desk, Maria wept only once. Not for him, not for the crown, but for the letter that had never arrived. She returned to court for the funeral. She stood beside her younger brother, now King Henry IX, crowned in a kingdom still Catholic, still intact, still untouched by the fire that had scorched the rest of Europe. She wore black, spoke little, and bowed her head when the bells rang, and when it was over, when the crown had passed and the courtiers had found their new center of gravity, she returned to Ravenshade, older now, quieter, but still burning with that same invisible fire no one could quite name. And when asked, much later, in a rare interview by a foreign chronicler, what she remembered most from her years at Ravenshade, she simply said, "There are nights I would not explain, even if I could, because they were mine. There are names that weigh heavier than gold, heavier than crowns, heavier than sin. They are not chosen, they are inherited, passed like torches from hand to trembling hand, through blood, expectation, and history that cannot be outrun." The name was Henry, and it had belonged to a cardinal, to a father, to a king, and to a ghost long buried in a castle fever once tried to claim. And now, it belonged to a boy who had done nothing to deserve it, except be born Henry, son of Arthur II and Catherine of Aragon, had been born into a world designed for peace. He had never heard the crack of civil war, or the wail of a queen abandoned. He had been baptized beneath a ceiling, painted with saints and silence, his cradle lined with silk and Latin prayers, his childhood guarded by scholars and guards who whispered of Europe in terms of maps, not battlefields. But no matter how softly he was raised, how gently the world tried to carry him forward, the name still pressed against his shoulders like a crown forged too early, too heavy, too known. By the time he turned 18, England had already begun calling him our shield, not for anything he had done, but because of what he symbolized: continuity. the firstborn of a king who had never broken from Rome, the heir to a dynasty that had never shattered itself against divorce and ambition, the boy who reminded them that nothing, no Reformation, no queen, no rebellion had ever touched them. His very presence was a prayer answered, an old wound that never reopened. And yet, within him, something struggled. He had his mother's mind and his father's silence. He read more than he jousted. And though his tutors praised his precision and memory, they whispered of his solitude. He did not play easily with others. He did not laugh when he did not mean to. He asked questions that priests were careful how to answer. At 13, he refused to kiss the relic brought from Rome, saying only that some holiness is better seen from far away. At 15, he vanished for 2 days during Lent, and returned from the northern woods with a scrap of parchment tied around his wrist, a poem. Some said, written in a hand that was not his. No one asked what it said. And then, at 19, the rumors began. Not about Henry, but about her. She had arrived at court under a different name, with a lineage too tangled to matter, and a face that mattered too much. She was called Isabel of Ainswick, the daughter of a border knight with no land, and a mother who had once served under Queen Catherine, before being dismissed for reasons never written down. Isabel spoke little, danced rarely, and moved through the palace like a shadow dressed in midnight blue. Some called her beautiful. Others said she was plain, but all agreed on one thing when Prince Henry looked at her. He forgot where he was. No one knew when it began. Whether it was the winter she brought him a book of German hymns, or the summer he gave her a lily from the Abbey garden, still wet with dew. They were rarely alone, never foolish in public. But love does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply takes root, in glances that last too long, and silences too careful to be anything else. When it was discovered, there was no scandal. There was exile. Isabel was gone within 48 hours. No trial. No confrontation. No confession. The king said nothing. The cardinal said even less. And Henry, the boy with the name and the future, and the crown already measuring his brow, stood in the chapel for 4 hours without kneeling, staring at the altar as if trying to see through it. When he emerged, he was pale, his fists clenched, and he did not speak for 3 days. What had happened in those nights? No one could say. Some believed there had been no sin, only emotion. Others were certain that the line had been crossed. A few whispered of a child, lost in silence before it was ever acknowledged. But truth, in courts built on image, is a fragile thing. What mattered was not what had happened, but how it was handled, and it was handled with ruthless elegance. But shame has a strange scent. It clings, and though Henry recovered in public, though he went on to study law and theology, to host banquets and bless harvests, something had shifted. He was no longer the shield. He was no longer just the name. He was a man who had been touched by something the court would not forgive, and in forgiving, would never forget. As for Isabel, she did not die. She was sent to a house on the coast, funded quietly by the crown, but unacknowledged in every ledger. She took no visitors. She answered no letters. She walked by the sea until her boots fell apart, and then walked barefoot. And when a young woman came to her gate 10 years later, child in hand, asking if she had once known the prince, she did not answer. She simply turned and pointed to the sea and said, "It does not matter anymore." And yet, in London, in the halls of power and painted ceilings, a small painting remained hidden in the prince's private chapel of a lily, pressed between 2 panes of glass. slightly browned with time, with no name beneath it. Some burdens are carried not by those who fall, but by those who keep walking. The last letter was never signed. It was found tucked between the pages of an old book of hours in the private chapel of Ravenshade. The ink faded but not yet vanished. The words pressed into the vellum like a breath held too long. There was no seal, no crest, no date, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was hers. Queen Maria had lived many lives by the time the letter was written. She had been a princess before the Reformation, a queen before the world fractured, a daughter of peace during a century that bled itself dry for doctrine and pride. She had stood beside emperors, bowed before popes, and walked barefoot through English soil that remembered her name even when history began to forget. She had once been the golden child of two thrones. But time had turned her into something else, the last witness of a world that had almost stayed whole. She had returned to Ravenshade in the autumn of the year 1555. Long after her brother's second son had taken the crown. Long after her cousin Eleanor's name had faded from court. Long after Vienna had stopped writing. The castle was quieter now. The roses no longer bloomed as fiercely. The chapel roof leaked when the wind blew from the sea. But it was hers, and she had no interest in palaces anymore. The letter, though never named as such, read like a farewell. Not to a person, but to time itself. It spoke of a day when she had walked along the cliffs and seen a ship in the distance, white-sailed and too fast for the tide. And for a moment, she had believed it was meant for her. It spoke of the nights she had listened to the wind moving through the cracks in the stone walls and thought she heard her mother's voice. It spoke of names she had once whispered in candlelight. Names no longer spoken aloud in court. Names that had once made her hand tremble. It ended with a single line, "I will not open the door again, even if he knocks." She was not ill. There was no decline. No court physician was summoned. She simply slowed. Each day she walked a little less. Each night she lit fewer candles. Her letters stopped. Her window stayed shuttered. Even when the spring thaw came, and when the young King Henry X, her nephew's son, crowned in Westminster, with all the pomp of a kingdom that still called itself untouched, sent word asking if she might return for the christening of his daughter. The reply was sent back in the hand of her steward. Her Majesty regrets that she no longer travels. Her door remains closed. The last ride came on a morning drowned in mist. No one knows who the rider was. The guards at the gate said only that he wore no crest, carried no weapons, and asked no questions. He brought a letter, unopened and unsealed, and requested to deliver it to the Queen in person. The steward, seeing no reason to deny a request made with such stillness, escorted him to the great oak door of the west wing, the only door Maria ever opened herself. But that morning, she did not open it. From within, a voice said, "Only, leave it beneath the bell." And so the rider did. He placed the letter folded once, the handwriting foreign and hesitant on the old stone step, beneath the rusted bell rope that had not rung in over 20 years. He waited for a moment. Then he turned, mounted, and rode back into the mist. The letter remained untouched. 3 days later, the steward knocked. No answer. The door was locked. When the locksmith arrived from Durham, the castle stood utterly silent. The gardens were overgrown. The chapel candles had all burned out, and when the door was finally forced open, the room smelled of dried lavender and old paper. Queen Maria was seated in her high-backed chair by the hearth, dressed in black, her hands folded, her eyes closed. Beside her, on the table, were two things: the old book of hours, with the unsent letter still inside, and the unopened note left by the writer, untouched, unread, unburned. The door, true to her word, had remained shut. The funeral was held at dusk. There was no great procession, no golden canopy, no trumpet song echoing through cathedral arches, only soft chanting, a candlelit bier, and a single riderless horse walking behind the coffin. She was buried not in Westminster, nor in the family crypt beneath St. George's Chapel, but beneath the chapel at Ravenshade, beside the western wall, where the ivy grew thickest. No statue was raised, no plaque named her a queen. Only a single carved line marked the stone. She did not open the door. And in London, when the bells rang, there were those who paused, old courtiers, gray-haired abbots, one or two women who had once worn her livery. They paused and remembered, though they said little. The new king issued a proclamation of mourning. The court wore black for 6 days, but no one truly spoke her name again, because she had carried it too long, and too carefully, to let it be worn lightly by anyone else. And so ended the life of the queen who outlived her world, who returned every crown that had ever been placed in her hands, and who chose, at the end, to shut the door, not out of bitterness, nor sorrow, but because sometimes history must end in silence to keep its shape. He was never a man given to dreams. King Arthur II had ruled for nearly 4 decades without spectacle, without scandal, without the roar of war or the fire of revolution. He had guided his kingdom like a scholar, turning the pages of a fragile manuscript slowly, carefully, with reverence for what had come before and a quiet fear of what might come next. He had kept England Catholic when the rest of the continent tore itself open. He had raised his children with dignity, never desperation. He had never broken a woman. It never burned a heretic in rage, never rewritten the laws to fit his longing. His court was not golden, but it was good. And yet, in the last years of his life, when his hair had thinned and his knees had begun to betray him on the long chapel stairs, there were nights he would wake in a cold sweat, reaching not for God but for a name. He never said aloud, it was not Catherine. She had been his queen, his partner, his mirror in faith and rule, and the mother of the children who carried his peace forward like a fragile lamp through a century of gathering wind. He had loved her, but with the love one gives a cathedral not breathless, not broken, but holy and still. And when she died, he did not weep. He simply walked the garden once, alone, and never again entered the oratory they had built together. It was not Maria, though she had carried his hopes farther than he ever could have. Her silence had protected the crown. Her absence had kept the realm intact. She had been everything he needed her to be, except close. The name that haunted him belonged to no one. The records kept. It had never been entered into the royal accounts, never been announced at court, never embroidered into the tapestries that lined the Hall of Queens. And yet, she had been there once, perhaps twice, and always behind the door. Some said she had been a lady in waiting. Others said she had been the daughter of a foreign envoy. Still others said she had simply appeared in the winter of one year and vanished by the spring of the next. But Arthur remembered. She had spoken little. She had worn dark green. Her hands had been ink-stained from books he had not known were in the palace library. And once, on an evening when the court had danced until the wax pooled beneath the chandeliers, she had stood in the gallery above, alone, watching not him, not the crowd, but something only she could see. When their eyes met, He had known two things: that he would never forget her, and that he could never name her, not because he was ashamed, but because naming her would have made her real, and real things had consequences. So he let the silence carry her. Let the records erase her. Let the world believe there had been no one who had made the king sit up straighter. Speak more softly. Walk more slowly when he passed the west window where she had once stood, and when, years later, he received a single rose pressed between the pages of a psalter, with no note, no seal, and no signature. He said nothing. He placed it in his study drawer. And each year on the same day, he took it out, held it once, and returned it to the dark. By the time his son was crowned, Arthur had grown thin with grace. He had nothing to prove, no enemies left, and no need to explain the decades he had lived without conquest or collapse. England was intact, and that was enough. But when he died quietly, alone, seated at his desk, with his hands folded over an unfinished letter, there was one last surprise. In the folds of his robe was a piece of parchment, yellowed and worn, that bore a single line, in the careful script of a woman long vanished: "I do not need to be remembered, only not replaced." It was not dated. It was not signed. But the crown, for all its power, he could not undo the truth it whispered, because in the end, there are some women history cannot crown, not because they were unworthy, but because the crown itself could not carry the weight of what they were. And there are kings, good kings, just kings, quiet kings who live long, rule well, and leave the world better than they found it. But even they are haunted, in their last quiet hours, not by battles left unfought, but by the doors they chose not to open, the ones they still listen for, the ones they never knock on again. And so ends the story of a kingdom that chose peace over glory, faith over fire, silence over spectacle. A kingdom where Arthur lived, where England remained whole, and where love quiet, unspoken, unburied, stood behind the curtain and never bowed. A world that was never ours, but might have been